Yeah, National Insurance Contributions Mythbusting was the title that we ultimately came up for this presentation this morning. As Joe says, I'll just run through fairly quickly. I've got some worked examples and then just some thoughts at the end. But obviously, the main thing is about you guys having the opportunity to ask questions once I've been through the slides. So, first of all, a little bit about who we are. So, we're a full service accountancy practice based in Hazel Grove, 22 people with a couple of new people to start in the fairly near future. And our sort of focus mainly is kind of small and medium sized enterprises of all types, really. So from owner managed businesses, individuals, and some third sector organisations as well. My role is I'm the tax director here, so I'm basically responsible for all of the tax services that the firm provides to our clients. So I think maybe the first thing that I just thought is kind of go through a little bit about the numbers, and this is quite numbers heavy, but it's a numbers game to a large extent. So sort of forgive me, and hopefully you don't go too number blind first thing on a Monday morning. So we're going to focus on employers' contributions because that's the thing that's changing. Employees' national insurance isn't actually going to change. And I mean, very broadly, and this is very, very sort of high level stuff, but there's actually three types of national insurance that employers pay. There's what's called Class 1 secondary. That's the main one, which is on people's salaries, on wages. Then there's two types where sort of Class 1A and 1B are on benefits in kind, which I guess for a lot of third sector organisations probably not a major focus, but something to be aware of. The current rate 13.8% above the relevant threshold, and I've listed what the relevant thresholds there are at the moment. So at the moment, the secondary threshold, the point at which employers start to pay national insurance, is 9,100 in the current year. Obviously, there's higher thresholds because the government are trying to encourage organisations to recruit people like apprentices, younger employees as well. And if you've got employees who are over the state pension age, whatever that is for the individual at this stage, then they won't have any national insurance for those guys as well. So that's where we are at the moment, and I'm sure you're all kind of familiar with the numbers. So if we just then talk about the other factor, which is within national insurance contributions for employers, and it's the employment allowance. And it essentially says that if your employer's national insurance bill for the year is less than £5,000, then you kind of don't end up actually having to pay the national insurance because you get this offset. It's only once you go over £5,000 that you pay it, and then it's only on the excess over £5,000. Now, for a lot of our commercial clients, they sometimes have a number of companies within their group or organisation. I guess you could conceivably have connected third sector organisations, but essentially you only get one £5,000 allowance between all of those. And at the moment, employers with an annual national insurance bill of over 100,000, they don't get that employment allowance at all. And again, more for commercial clients really, but if you've just got a company that's had a single director, then they can't claim the employment allowance either. But as I say, by way of an example, let's say once you've calculated all your employer's national insurance for the year and it comes to 12,000, you can knock your 5,000 employment allowance off, and that reduces your national insurance bill to £7,000 for the year. So that's kind of where we are now, if you like. And obviously, we've got the significant changes that Rachel Reeves announced in the budget in October, and I think the two key ones are listed on the screen there. So first of all, the employer's national insurance rate is going to go up to 15% from April. I think this was something that actually was briefly introduced by the previous Conservative government, and obviously, it is a hit. 1.2% increase on the national insurance bill is not a small thing at all, but I think a lot of organisations felt that in isolation they could probably cope with that in the past. But where the big change is on that secondary threshold. So just as a reminder, that's the threshold above which employers start to pay national insurance contributions for their employees, and that's gone down from 9,100 to 5,000. And I think for a lot of organisations, that's the change that's causing the most concern, because you're now paying 15% on an extra 4,100 of wages for each employee that you have. So I think, you know, from that point of view, it's really quite a significant impact, and that's the area where I think, particularly for organisations which might have a lot of low-paid employees, that's where the hit's coming. The government did make one change to compensate to a certain extent, and hopefully some of the examples will show that at the smaller end of the scale for employers, then actually this change kind of does balance out, and potentially actually means some smaller employers will pay less national insurance post-April. So the employment allowance, which I mentioned, currently is at £5,000. That's now going to increase to £10,500. So the same rules apply, except for larger employers, they can now get the employment allowance, because the rule that said, well, if your NIC bill is more than 100 grand a year, you can't get it, that's now been removed. So there's, you know, but that, up at that scale, the sort of the extra 5,500 of employment allowance isn't really going to compensate for the increases. But for smaller employers, so if you go back to our employer, which has got an annual employer's bill of £12,000, you knock the employment allowance off, and that's actually reduces their bill now to 1,500 as opposed to the 7,000 that it was under the new rules. So, you know, for smaller employers, there is actually, you know, there are some positives to come from the changes, but as we'll kind of work through in the examples, and I'll just skip through these really quickly because I'm conscious it might be better use of everybody's time if you do have any questions. But, you know, at the smaller end of the scale, actually there are some real positives that come out of these changes. But once you go above the sort of level where this impact, whether the employment allowance kind of doesn't start to compensate, then the impact does rise quite significantly. So, and again, forgive me that there's going to be an awful lot of numbers here. I will just skip through them, but I think I just wanted to sort of illustrate how at different salary levels, the rules are going to impact employers. So let's say we've got an employer, you know, small employer, it's only got 3 employees and they're all, you know, part-time. So they're only earning, you know, I guess £15,000 a year. So under the current rules, they'd have no national insurance because a combination of the threshold at 9,100 each, and also the employment allowance means that they've got no national insurance. And for these guys, then under the current rules, although in theory their bill goes up, because the employment allowance still covers their national insurance due, that 4,500 in the right-hand column there, there's still no net national insurance due for these guys at all. So, you know, in one sense, for that sort of size of employer, their situation isn't going to change. And you know, even if we go to 5 employers, the same applies. Then although there is an increase again in their overall bill, the employment allowance at 10,500 means that they're still not paying national insurance. So 5 employees, each with, you know, on an average, say, of 15,000 per head, we're still not seeing any real impact from these changes. And similarly, and actually this is an instance where the changes, you know, can benefit, and I appreciate these numbers are very artificial and there's a lot of variables here, but I think it's interesting to see that, and I'm not by any means trying to put a positive spin on this overall, but I think there are some positives, as I say. The employer with 7 employees, each with 15,000 annual salary, then their national insurance bill does go up at the gross level, but then the employment allowance now actually means that at being at 10,500, the net national insurance due is still nil, whereas under the current rules, they would have had to pay £700 in national insurance in the year. So actually, for this size of employer, we're seeing a positive benefit from the rules, because although the rates have increased and the thresholds have reduced, the actual employment allowance increase means that they still end up slightly ahead of the game from a cost point of view. However, when we get to 9 employees, beg your pardon, skipped on a little bit there. We get to 9 employees, then this is where we see for this sort of level of remuneration. So if we've got, again, a relatively part-time heavy business or organization with 9 employees, this is the threshold at which the national insurance changes do start to have an adverse effect, because the increase in the employment allowance no longer compensates for the overall increase in their national insurance bill. So, but again, for smaller employers at that sort of level, employing a lot of part-time people, and conceivably at a lower level, there is actually some benefit for them. Moving up the scale a little, and I won't sort of dwell on these other than to say, 3 employees, 25,000 annual salary, then on average the changes actually produce a positive outcome for this employer, because the employment, although their national insurance calculated at 9,000 is up from what it was previously, the employment allowance being at 10,500 means that they actually end up with no national insurance to pay at all. Similarly, if they've got 5 employees, then we're still in a beneficial situation, because although there is a national insurance bill, the employment allowance compensates. But when these guys get to 7 employees on an average of 25,000 each, at this point, that's where the national insurance, the increases in the rates, the reduction in the threshold outweigh the extra benefit of the employment allowance. And we do actually see, in this case, a fairly small increase. But you take that up to 10 employees and you can see suddenly that's 2.5 grand of extra national insurance that this organisation is paying on an average salary of 25k. Moving on again a little further up the chain, and again, I won't dwell. 3 employees, we still get a bit of a decrease here because of the increased employment allowance. Even at 5 employees on 40k each, then they're still doing a little bit better. But here, the change kicks in when we've got 6 employees at that salary level. Then this is the point at which the national insurance rises kick in. So I guess you can straight away start to see that effectively the higher the average salary level, the less number of employees the organisation will have before the changes start to have an adverse impact. And again, by the time we get up to 10 employees, then that's close on £4,500 extra per year that this employer would have to be paying, which even with 10 employees and 40k a year, that's a big cost for the employer. Where I think the changes, I personally think, do impact quite adversely is actually, strangely, when you've got businesses where the employees are only on, say, 10k, or organizations where the employees only on 10k a year, so they're barely over the national insurance threshold. So and we can sort of skip through and say 5 employees, we're still no national insurance. 7 employees at 10k a year, no national insurance. But actually, when you get to 15 employees, then you're suddenly in a position where you are paying national insurance, because the threshold has actually dropped to such an extent, and it's the threshold reduction here that's really hurting rather than the increase in the rate. But you can see on the left-hand side, the column there, even at 15 employees, and even with an employment allowance of 5,000, there's going to be an awful lot. There's a long way to go with this particular employer before they would be paying national insurance under the old rules, because at that sort of 10,000 level, the national insurance bill is quite small per head. You can have a lot of employees before you, and effectively we're talking about 180 odd quid per head. Sorry, less than that, about 130 quid per head per employee. So you have to have a lot of employees to get to 5,000 and be more the employment allowance. But here we've got to 15 employees. They're only earning, each of these employees, 10,000 a year, but effectively we're straight into the national insurance. So I think that the really nasty part of these rules are that it does impact on businesses where you might have a lot of I don't know, people doing 2 or 3 days a week, their salary's quite low. You would have expected to have pretty much a no national insurance for any of the employees under the old rules. Suddenly you've only got to have 15 people on 10K a year, and you're starting to see a national insurance hit. And I think it's at that sort of level, unfortunately. And I wish I could bring some good news, but from that perspective, then we are sort of we are in a position where a lot of these employees are going to fall into national insurance fairly much for the first time. I mean, I guess the key messages, and I'm conscious I am rattling through this, but I want to give people the time to ask questions. Smaller employers, the reality is actually potentially aren't better off as a consequence of these changes. And I think it's that, although, it's a minor, but it's a relatively small proportion potentially of all of the employers. But actually, for a lot of employers, these rules do have a positive impact because although their calculated national insurance bill goes up, as I say, I know I sound like a broken record, the 10,500 national employer allowance does mean that they are actually making savings at that level. But as I said, you can see that as salary levels go up, 15 employees, you can at 10K, 10K per annum is the point at which, the changes start to have an adverse effect. But you only need 6 employees at the higher salary levels before you start to see an adverse impact from the changes because of the employment allowance ceases to compensate. And I think the key thing is that once we tip over that threshold, unfortunately, the reality is that the numbers do tend to go up quite quickly in terms of the national insurance liability that arises. But I think, as I say, the challenging bit for me is for those organisations that do employ a lot of part-time workers. Now, the slide's actually poorly worded there because I've said that sort of I've kind of not really specified there, but you do need a lot of employees at 10K a year if that's your average remuneration before you actually get to pay national insurance under the old rules. Whereas now, if you've only got 15 employees on 10K a year, then you're into paying employers national insurance. So unfortunately, I feel at that bottom end of the scale where the businesses haven't got, or the organizations haven't got the resources necessarily to be able to cope with the extra cost, but the extra costs do hit disproportionately. So that I think is, the real key sort of, and the real, for me, challenging sort of impact of these changes. Can just get the slide to move on. So, just some thoughts on mitigation strategies. So I've seen there's been a lot of chat around about how well, a lot of organizations are now saying, well, actually, we don't want to employ people, we'll move to engage freelancers because if somebody's a freelancer, we don't have to pay national insurance for them at all. And that is true, provided they are genuinely freelancers. And I think that the handle with care message there is a really important one, because effectively, if you've got somebody who goes home as an employee on Friday, and you say, well, on Monday when you come in, you're going to be a freelancer, but you're going to be performing exactly the same role in exactly the same way as you were previously, then the taxman's going to come along and say, well, if you look like an employee and you smell like an employee, then you actually are an employee. And I think there is a sense in the market, and I'm not saying within the third sector at all, but more broadly, we've just got to put somebody on a different contract, and that turns them into a freelancer, and we don't need to worry about employers' national insurance. And it's a favourite topic with HMRC if they're looking at organisations from a pay-as-you-earn point of view. They really want to crawl all over the sort of the arrangements with freelancers to make sure that they aren't actually just employees given a different contract and said, oh, we don't need to worry about. So, in certain circumstances, it absolutely can be a positive, but you really need to be very careful and get it right. And sometimes the cost of putting it in place in terms of cost of new contracts, etc., mean that those costs can actually outweigh the savings that you make. So, yes, a lot of chat in various sort of press and in various journals, but definitely a handle with care on that one, I would say. Salary sacrifice again, this is potentially of limited application, but essentially salary sacrifice, for those who aren't familiar with it, means essentially the employee says to the employer, well, instead of you paying me cash remuneration, I want you to provide me with a benefit of some description in a non-cash form. Now, in order for this to work, then, non-cash benefits are quite limited, but it can be the cycle to work scheme. It can be, believe it or not, electric cars. If somebody gives up, it's very tax efficient for somebody to give up their salary in exchange for being provided with an electric car, bizarrely. And it actually saves the employer an awful lot of national insurance as well. But obviously, you're only really talking about people at the higher salary ranges there where that's effective. But it can, if structured properly, actually be, significant savings for the employee and the employer. But probably the one that's most common that we see is pension contributions. So if an employee says, well, I want to give up £5,000 of my salary a year and I want you instead to pay that into my pension, then those payments into the pension don't attract national insurance for either the employers or the employees. So straight away, you're saving 15% of £5,000 by making a salary sacrifice into that employee's pension. Then you have to get the paperwork right. I mean, the employee has to be careful that, it is the right thing for them to do. But in principle, it is quite an attractive option. Or if you've got people where you're currently paying auto enrollment contributions for them, and it's this sort of the employer's paying 3%, the employee's paying 5% situation, then if you switch that 5% employee's contribution to salary sacrifice, so the employer's paying 8%, then the employer's not paying national insurance. Whereas if you're paying somebody's salary out of which they're paying pension contributions, the employer is paying national insurance. So with a little bit of thought and creating a few options for your employees, there are actually ways that you can save a bit of national insurance. What a lot of employers, including here at IN, say in that situation is, well, actually, we're going to share some of that benefit of the national insurance saving with you. So some employers will say, well, we're saving 15%, so we'll just pay an extra 15% into your salary, into your pension rather. Other employers will say, well, we're saving 15%, so we'll get the benefit of 7.5%, and we'll pay 7.5% into your pension. So that's kind of where I get to with the giving more for less kind of scenario. So I do think, I'm not saying it's necessarily, for everyone. If you've got somebody who's 27, then offering to put more into their pension each year might not necessarily be the most attractive if they've got a mortgage and a couple of young kids, but it is something that is worth thinking about. It goes without saying, maximising volunteer involvement. I really don't need to tell you guys about stuff like that, but obviously, I guess the more work that can be done by volunteers, the less costs you've got. I think that whole full-time versus part-time starts to really come into sharp focus as well. I think it's, again, just a little bit, I suppose, a lot of this around workforce planning, really, to a certain extent. It's a really unfortunate situation. You're hearing a lot of talk about people saying, well, we're just not going to employ people because it's too expensive. But just taking the time to look at your workforce and understanding the makeup, understanding whether there's opportunities to bring people in where, say, for example, can we bring on somebody who's an apprentice into a role? We save the national insurance, and through the apprenticeship levy, you can potentially get up to 90% of the cost of their training paid for by the government as well. And forgive me, I'm sure I'm teaching you all to suck eggs here to a certain extent, but I think what it's forcing a lot of our commercial clients particularly to do is take a long, hard look at the makeup of their workforces and just understand, is it the most efficient profile that we've got? Look at going back to the full-time versus part-time, is it, more beneficial for us to employ one full-time person rather than two part-time people? It's an awful calculation to have to make because you want to be able to give work to people, and well-paid work, but, people are having to make some fairly hard decisions. And I guess, and I'm sure you're all aware of this lastly, but don't be afraid to sort of really, really sort of make this part of your messaging to your donors and your funders, I suppose. Just explain to them that, you know, through nothing that we have done as an organization, our costs are going to go up, and can you actually help us to fund these? So I don't have a silver bullet, unfortunately, by any stretch of the imagination, and I'm sure you've all been sitting there thinking about a lot of this stuff already, but just really taking a bit of a step back, investing a bit of time looking at your workforce. Are there any tweaks that we can make which might soften the impact of some of these changes? I think could well be time well spent, because of, we're already hearing that there may need to be more tax rises and more tax rises, and so this isn't going to go away anytime soon. And whilst some of my clients say to me, "Oh, well, we've just got to stick it out for a few years, we'll get a different government and they'll change the rules back to how they were," experience suggests that once these tax changes have been in place for a couple of years, any future government isn't going to sort of reverse them, because it just costs them money, frankly, and that money is hardwired and baked into budgets. So I think this is here for the long term. It's not something where we're getting any sense that they're thinking about softening it. I think there were questions and debates in Parliament before Christmas, if I remember rightly, that talked about third sector and the impact, but there didn't seem to be any appetite to try and soften the changes for third sector organisations either, unfortunately. So I think we have to accept this is the new world order from April, and just try and sort of do what we can to mitigate the impact as best as we possibly can. And I think that's it. Happy to sort of, I'm sure that hopefully there are some questions, but if not, I'm sure Lee will share the slides with Joe and the team, and so you'll have my contact details there. So by all means, if there's something that occurs to you which you think, "Oh, I wish I'd asked that when Paul was jabbering away on Monday morning," and but you only remember on Wednesday, drop me an email. Happy to help. There may be something specific that we can just give you a little bit of a view or a steer on. So I've got no concerns about doing that at all. And
Thank
with
you,
that,
Paul. Yeah.
I'll stop sharing.
Thank you, Paul. That was really, really insightful. And I think just giving some thought around that mitigating some of the impacts at the end was really helpful. I think going on the point around the funding, the messages to funders and commissioners, is something that we've been doing at the GM level. So we've got a GM VCFSE leadership team, and we've pulled together some evidence from around Greater Manchester, including Stockport, around the impact of a number of things on the sector, not just NI, but not reflecting uplifts in contracts and things like that. And we've always, as a sector, never really had full cost recovery. A lot of the time we subsidise contracts with fundraising efforts and things like that. So there's a couple of letters that I've put on there. There's some key messages from the VCFSE sector that anyone on this call can use, with just updating your trustees on what's happening and what we're doing to try and get some support for the sector. But also you can do campaigns yourself as organisations, get behind some of the key messages. And we're going to be doing some work around that. We videoed Sandy, actually, Maya, last week, just to get her, just to bring some of that GM intelligence alive and make it real for Stockport commissioners. Beacon Council's been going for 40 odd years. It's an amazing organisation. These impacts are having an effect on your ability. And obviously we know that the demand on Beacon Counselling has massively increased since the pandemic in terms of mental health services. So yeah, all of that, we just, if we can come together as a sector just to share some of those messages. And so everyone, those that are in the system can hopefully do something about it on our behalf. But no, that was really helpful, Paul. Thank you. And I'll just open up for questions if anyone's got any.
Stunned you all into silence.
So for me personally, I'm just sitting in to take notes for Sandy and Charlotte today. Yeah. So I'm sure that if they do, I'm not very well versed with NI and kind of, or the impact of what they're deciding down at Westminster. But I'm sure that, you know, once they're back and got an idea and read through my notes and had a look at some of the documents you sent in, you will be getting, I imagine you'll be getting some emails from them, just to clarify anything that I may not have gotten down adequately enough. But I think just from an apprentice point of view, because I've been hired as a fundraising apprentice in the past couple of months, how, obviously there'll be funding from the government for organisations to employ apprentices, but beyond that, where's the kind of appeal in organisations going for more apprentices? Because of course it's a 12 to 18 month course. At the end of it, these apprentices are going to be looking for full-time work. So what are the impacts that these NI contributions are going to have for these future full-time workers once they've graduated their programme?
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, it's a really good point, because essentially, you know, you do get the benefit while you're on the apprenticeship, but once you don't, then the national insurance bill that's associated with the apprentice does increase, you know, back to the sort of normal level, so you don't get the concessions. So there is, and I think it's one thing, it is a bright line, unfortunately, and I think whether there's a way that over time they could soften that a little with the transition, because to go from saying to somebody you can earn over 50 grand before, up to 50 grand before we pay national insurance, to suddenly you paying national insurance on anything over 5,000 is a massive impact. So yeah, I think it's a really good point, Maya. You know, you don't just need to look at it as a short-term fix, but it is a how are we going to accommodate this in the long term. And I think that is, again, it goes back to the whole workforce planning piece. So, and I don't think, again, it's a classic government policy which hasn't been thought through beyond the point of, oh, look, great, we're encouraging people to take on apprentices. But then it's kind of, well, we drop you like a hot stone as soon as you get to, there's no support once you transition to somebody sort of who's, you know, gone through the apprenticeship program and is suddenly a full-time employee. You know, I think the other point to mention here, of course, is not just the NI changes, and I'm sure you're all very, very aware of this. It's also, of course, the increase in national minimum wage as well, which is impacting on people's cost base. And you know, it's very, very difficult to sort of complain about you know, people actually being paid, you know, a living wage, or, well, I'd still question whether the national living wage is actually genuinely a living wage, obviously, but it's close to it now from April than it was. But you know, the other side of this is, how does that impact on the employers? And it's not just, is it, I guess, and you know, perhaps less of an issue in third sector, but perhaps not. But certainly from our point of view, we're looking at it saying, you know, if we bring somebody in on a higher on the minimum wage, you know, from a client's point of view, then people who are more experienced are going to expect to maintain the differential as well. So, you know, if I'm on £27,000 a year, and suddenly you're bringing in somebody on the sort of the new minimum wage at, I don't know what the numbers are, let's say it's 25, then I might say, well, £2,000 isn't a lot of extra remuneration for my experience over somebody who's literally just starting. So we're seeing upward pressure, you know, on throughout the sort of salary levels, unfortunately, as well. So, you know, I massively think that, you know, people need to be paid fairly for the work that they do. I would never dispute that at all, but the government needs to think, and I say needs to, whether they will or not, but you can't just throw these keep throwing costs at employers and expect them just to keep absorbing it. But unfortunately, there does seem to be a slight short-sightedness in terms of, we only see one side of the equation on a lot of these measures. Sorry, it's a bit of a rant more than anything particularly informative there, but it's something I'm quite passionate about, really. So.
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's really helpful. And I just wanted to clarify one more thing in terms of pension payments. So if the employee was to say that, okay, so I'm paying, say, £2,500 into my pension every year, if they were to go to their employer, so say I was to go to Sandy and be like, look, I would like to see that £2,500, if she was to then be like, okay, we can put that into your salary now, I'll pay that 2.5 grand, she won't have to pay NI contributions for that, and it would kind of be a bit of a buffer, so to speak.
Yeah, no, it's actually the other way around, Mate. So effectively, the employer's obliged, unless you opt out, to make pension contributions on your behalf, and you're obliged to as well. So you can opt out, I think, and effectively have it as cash. But I think it's more the other way around, where if you're getting 2.5 grand and you want 5 grand into your pension then there is a saving to be made for both you and the employer by moving it to, I mean, I won't bore you with the details, but essentially for your pension contributions, if you got paid 2 grand and then you wanted to put that into pension, you could get the tax back on that 2 grand to a certain extent, but you couldn't get the national insurance back. Once you paid that, you paid that. Whereas if the employer pays it, you never pay the national insurance, so there's saving for you and for the employer as well. So it's more kind of looking at somebody who's a young person like yourself, an extra few grand into your pension might not be the most attractive at the moment if you've got rent to pay or a mortgage to pay or whatever. But as people of more advanced years like me, it's actually quite attractive to sort of see more getting tipped into my pension, for example. So.
Oh, sorry, cool, thank you. That's really helpful.
No problem, pleasure, no problem at all.
Are there any other questions? Well, lots to think about, and we've obviously Paul shared his contact details helpfully, so we can come back to him if we've got anything on reflection. But I think it's quite a useful set of slides to share with trustees as they're getting their heads around this. Obviously, we might all be working with accountants, which hopefully they'll know what the impact is. But I think that whole mitigation and kind of thinking about forward planning, because we are seeing organisations having to cut jobs or raid reserves or scale back services. So yeah, I think if you want any help in terms of any organisational development around looking at that, then we can perhaps put something else on around workforce planning in response to the needs of the sector. So yeah, just let us know if there's anything we can do at Sector 3 to support. Obviously, for anything professional services or technical stuff, speak to Paul. I'm not the right person for that.
Yeah, I'm genuinely happy to sort of have a chat about any of this stuff. I may not have any great answers, but at least if I can help to clarify things, then I'm happy to do that.
And any local evidence or stories around your own organisations or other organisations that are struggling through this, then please let us know, and we'll use that as part of our campaign to local decision makers and commissioners and things. Fab. Well, thank you very much for your time. Have a great week, and I really appreciate it that IN Accountancy, award-winning IN Accountancy, Stockport based, was here to support. So thank you ever so much.
No, pleasure. Really lovely to see you all.
Thank you. Bye
Thanks,
now.
guys. Bye.
Thanks. It's really useful, Paul. Thanks very much.
Thanks a lot.
Cheers,
Bye
Jonathan. Have a good week. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.